You know, there's this phrase I hear constantly in tech circles.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Data is the new oil. And I mean, I'm sure you've heard it too.
1,000 times. It's a total cliche.
It is, but I think there's a specific slice of that data that feels less like oil and maybe more like, well, like infrastructure. It's aware.
The geospatial layer.
Exactly. I mean, whether you're optimizing a supply chain, tracking a virus, or just trying to figure out why your food delivery is going in circles, location is the context for almost everything. But here's the problem, and I'm speaking from very painful experience here. Working with location data is incredibly messy. It's not just rows and columns.
No, it's curved surfaces and distorted projections and these massive files that just crash your laptop. It's notoriously difficult.
Right.
It's a domain where, you can know all the Python in the world, but if you don't understand the underlying geography, the actual shape of the Earth, you're going to get the wrong answer.
And you might not even know it's wrong.
Not until you try to navigate a truck into a river.
Which is why today we are doing a deep dive into the brand new second edition of Geospatial Data Science Essentials. 101 Practical Python Tips and Tricks by Milan Janosov, and this just dropped in 2026.
And that date is actually really important.
It is, right, because the first edition was 2024, and 2 years doesn't sound like much.
In normal time, no. But in the Python ecosystem, that's practically a geological epoch.
It really is.
Yeah, the geospatial stack. I mean, the specific libraries and tools we use, it's matured incredibly fast.
Yeah.
This second edition isn't just a reprint with a new cover.
No.
It's capturing a fundamental shift in the industry. We're moving away from just making maps to doing really rigorous, heavy-lifting data science on maps.
So the mission today is to decode that shift.
Right.
We want to walk through Janosov's core architecture, to understand how to go from a blank script to a predictive model.
Good.
And to build that foundation, we have to start with the absolute basics. The book splits the world into two very distinct data types.
Vector and raster, the two languages of location.
Let's start with vector. To me, this feels, I don't know, more intuitive. It's how we draw.
That's a great way to put it. It's like sketching a map on a napkin. Vector data represents the world as these discrete objects, things with clear boundaries.
So in the book, Janosov breaks this down into three basic geometries.
Points, lines, and polygons.
Okay, but let's get specific. In an actual data set, what am I looking at?
A point is just a coordinate pair, latitude and longitude. That's your cafe, your fire hydrant, a person standing on a corner.
Single location.
Right. A line is then just an ordered sequence of those points. Think of a road segment or a river. And a polygon is an enclosed area, a building footprint, a park, a country border.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
But here's where the Python side comes in. The book highlights the Shapely library. Why do we need a whole library just for shapes? Can I just store coordinates in a list?
You could, but you couldn't do anything with them. You'd just have numbers. Shapely provides the geometric logic. So if you have a point, say, a cafe, and a polygon, a neighborhood, Shapely is the math engine that answers the question. Is this cafe inside this neighborhood?
It handles the intersections, the overlaps, all that stuff.
All of it. It turns numbers into actual shapes that can interact.
But Shapely alone doesn't handle the data, right? Just the geometry.
Exactly. And that leads us to probably the most important tool in this entire stack, GeoPandas.
I feel like GeoPandas is the big aha moment for most data scientists getting into this field.
It really is.
Mhm.
Most people already know pandas. It's the standard for working with tabular data, an Excel sheet on steroids.
Right.
GeoPandas takes that familiar data frame and just adds one special column, the geometry column.
So if I have a spreadsheet of cities, I'd have a column for the name, like London, a column for population, then a third column that holds the actual polygon shape of the city boundary.
Precisely. And because that shape is embedded in the row, you can perform spatial operations on the entire table at once.
So you can filter not just by population 1 million?
But by location, intersects with this river. It marries the attribute data, the what, to the spatial data, the where.
Okay, so that's vector, discrete objects. But the world isn't always discrete. Temperature doesn't just stop at a border.
And elevation doesn't have a hard line where it suddenly becomes mountain.
Exactly.
And that's where raster data comes in, which is chapter 7 in the book. If vector is a drawing, raster is a photograph.
Okay.
It divides the world into a continuous grid of cells or pixels.
Like a digital image from my phone.
It is a digital image,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of the pixel just representing a color, That pixel represents a value.
So in an elevation raster, the pixel value is height in meters?
Right, or degrees Celsius in a temperature raster,
Yeah.
or people per square kilometer in a population density raster.
And the book talks about multi-band rasters. That's for satellite data, isn't it?
Yes, a standard photo has 3 bands, red, green, and blue. But satellites can capture bands the human eye can't see, like near infrared.
And you can stack those bands?
You stack them to analyze things like vegetation health. Healthy plants reflect infrared light very differently than stressed plants or concrete. So you're not just looking at a picture, you're analyzing this multi-dimensional matrix of spectral data.
So we have our building blocks. Vectors for things, rasters for surfaces. Now we have to actually look at them. Chapter 3 calls this the quantitative science of maps.
I love that phrasing. It distinguishes it from cartography as just an art form. It
Yeah.
implies measurement, you know.
But the ecosystem for visualization in Python seems, well, a little crowded. Janosov lists Matplotlib, Contextually, Folium, Plotly, PyDeck. If I just want to see my data, how do I pick one?
It really depends on what your final output is. Matplotlib is your workhorse. It's for static, publication quality maps.
But like for a report or a PDF.
Exactly. You want total control over every line and label, you use Matplotlib.
And Contextually.
Contextually is a helper. If you plot your data in Matplotlib, you just get shapes floating in white space.
All right, well, like abstract art.
Yeah. Contextually fetches map tiles, like the streets and parks from Google Maps, and puts them behind your data so it has context, hence the name.
Okay, but what if I want the user to be able to zoom in
Well,
or hover over a point to get more info?
then you need Folium or Plotly. They generate interactive HTML maps. You can pan, zoom, toggle layers. This is for dashboards, for web apps.
Where the user needs to explore. And PyDeck. That one sounds a bit more hardcore.
PyDeck is the heavy hitter. It's for high-performance 3D visualizations. If you want to visualize, say, millions of taxi trips in 3D without crashing your browser, PyDeck uses the GPU to render that.
So for really big data.
Big data. And when you want to see density and flow in 3 dimensions.
Speaking of 3D, this brings us to chapter 4, and honestly the biggest headache in this whole field, the 3D problem.
The bane of every geospatial analyst's existence.
The Earth is a sphere, well, technically an oblate spheroid, but my screen is flat.
Correct. And mathematically, you cannot flatten a sphere without breaking something. It's impossible.
You have to compromise.
You have to. You either distort the shape, the area, the distance, or the direction. You cannot preserve all 4.
And that's why on those old wall maps from school, Greenland looks like it's the size of Africa, right?
That's the perfect example. That's the Mercator projection. It was great for sailors because a straight line on the map was a straight bearing, but it massively distorts area as you get closer to the poles.
So the book really hammers home the importance of coordinate reference systems, or CRS. This isn't just metadata. It fundamentally changes your results.
Absolutely. Say you want to calculate population density. You need to measure the area of a city. If you use a CRS, like Mercator, your area calculation will be just plain wrong.
Which means your density is wrong.
Completely wrong. You have to reproject your data into what's called an equal area CRS before you do that math.
And what happens if you try to overlay 2 data sets that have different CRSs?
They won't line up. You'll have your buildings in London and your roads floating somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. The book makes a huge point of this. Managing CRS is the first thing you check. It's the is it plugged in of geospatial data.
Okay, let's move to part 3, managing the real world. Because big data in geospatial is really big.
It is.
If I have a data set of every Uber trip for a year, searching through that row by row to find trips in just one neighborhood seems inefficient.
It's impossibly slow. You'd be waiting for days. This is where spatial indexing comes in, which is chapter 5.
How does that actually work?
Think of a library. You don't scan every single book spine to find the Great Gatsby. You go to the index. It tells you aisle 4, shelf B.
Okay.
A spatial index does the same. It groups nearby geometries. The book talks about R trees, which basically draw bounding boxes around groups of shapes so the computer can say, is my point in this big box? No. Okay, I'm skipping all 10,000 shapes inside it.
It turns a search of millions into a search of dozens. Now that's for searching. But the book also talks about H3, the hexagonal grid system from Uber. I see these hexagons everywhere now. Why hexagons? Why not just squares?
This is a really fascinating bit of geometry. With a square grid, the distance from the center of a square to its neighbors is different. The neighbor to the right is closer than the one on the diagonal.
Right, the hypotenuse is longer.
Exactly.
Right.
But with the hexagon, the distance from the center to all 6 of its neighbors is identical.
Oh, that's clever.
It makes everything more consistent. It allows for much smoother analysis when you're modeling movement or aggregating data. It just normalizes the idea of a neighborhood.
It's like board game logic for city planning. Now, another bridge to cross is language. Humans use addresses. Computers use coordinates.
Geocoding, Chapter 6.
The book points to GeoP. Is it as simple as just typing in an address and getting back a coordinate?
In code, pretty much.
Yeah.
The complexity is in the service it connects to, like Nominatum or Google. The really tricky part is actually reverse geocoding.
Taking a GPS point and figuring out the address, why is that hard?
Because a point is precise, but an address is ambiguous. If I'm standing in your backyard, is my address your house? Or the street behind the fence? It needs a lot of logic to snap that point to the correct human label.
Which brings us to the data source itself. Chapter 8 is all about OpenStreetMap, or OSM.
The Wikipedia of maps. For data scientists, it is absolute gold.
Why use OSM instead of, say, Google Maps data?
Access. Google Maps is a proprietary product. Getting the raw data out to analyze, like, give me the geometry of every single road, is expensive and very restricted. OSM is open. You can download the entire planet's dataset if you want.
And the level of detail is kind of surprising. It's not just roads.
It's everything. Building heights, the surface material of a trail, the location of trash cans. The book shows how to use Python to just query this. You can say, download the geometry of every building in Berlin that is tagged as a cafe.
And that leads us perfectly into part 4, advanced analytics, because once you have that raw data from OSM, especially the road networks, you can do some really cool stuff.
Yeah, Chapter 9 is about spatial networks. This is where we stop treating the map as a picture and start treating it as a graph.
A graph in the mathematical sense. You mean nodes and edges.
Right. An intersection is a node. A street segment between them is an edge. And the book introduces this amazing library called OSMXX, which lets you download a city from OSM and instantly convert it into a graph you can analyze.
And once it's a graph, you can run all kinds of algorithms, like finding the shortest path.
The shortest path, sure, but Janosov goes further and talks about isochrones.
I love isochrones. Can you explain what those are?
An isochrone is basically a map of reachability. We usually think of distance in miles, right? It's 5 miles away.
Yeah.
But 5 miles on a highway is totally different than 5 miles through a busy downtown. An isochrone draws a polygon showing everywhere you can travel from a point within a specific time limit.
So show me everywhere I can walk to in 15 minutes.
Yes. And it produces these organic blobby shapes that follow the road network perfectly. It accounts for bridges, one-way streets, everything. It's the ultimate tool for assessing things like transit accessibility.
It changes the question from how close is it to how accessible is it?
Precisely that.
And finally, we get to the really cutting-edge stuff. Chapter 10, Geospatial Statistics and Machine Learning. Moving from describing what is there to predicting what will be there. But there's a catch, isn't there? You can't just throw spatial data into a normal machine learning model.
You can, but you really shouldn't. Standard ML assumes every data point is independent of every other data point.
Which in geography is just false.
It's fundamentally false. It's Tobler's first law of geography. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things.
Give me a concrete example.
House prices. The price of your house is heavily influenced by the price of the house next door. If you treat those two as independent data points, you're ignoring the single biggest predictor you have.
And that's called spatial autocorrelation.
That's it.
So how do we fix it? If the standard models are broken, what do we use?
You have to engineer spatial lag features. Basically, for every house, you create a new variable that summarizes the values of its neighbors. You literally tell the model, here's this house's size, and by the way, here's the average price of the 5 nearest houses.
And the book mentions a statistic, Moran's I. What's that for?
Moran's I is a global statistic. It tells you if your data is clustered, is it just random noise, or are the high values all grouping together? If Moran's I is high, you know you have a spatial pattern you need to account for.
And hotspot analysis.
That's the next step. It uses a different statistic, G, to find where those clusters are. It's not just saying clustering exists. It's drawing a red circle on the map around the neighborhood where crime is statistically significantly higher, for example.
And then there are clustering algorithms like DBSCAN.
Oh, DBSCAN is fantastic for noisy spatial data, like GPS pings. You have 1 million coordinates where taxis drop people off. DBSCAN can look at that cloud of points and find the dense clusters, the hotspots, while completely ignoring the random outliers. It discovers the points of interest from behavior alone.
It really shifts the perspective from here is a static map to here is a living system.
That's the whole goal. We're trying to capture the dynamics of the world in code.
So let's just synthesize this whole journey. We started with raw materials, vectors and rasters. We learned we have to project them correctly with the right CRS. We used spatial indexing to make the data searchable, enriched it with context from OpenStreetMap.
And then finally use spatial machine learning to understand the hidden relationships and dependencies between all those locations.
That is the full stack.
It is. And what I really appreciate about Janosov's book is that it doesn't treat these as separate things. It presents them as one single integrated workflow. It bridges that old gap between the GIS analyst who just makes maps and the data scientist who just builds models.
It really feels like a maturation of the whole field. We aren't just putting pins on a map anymore. We're calculating the underlying logic of the map itself.
And that empowers you to solve much more complex problems. You aren't just asking, where is the fire? You're asking, given the road network, the traffic, and the wind speed, where will the fire be in an hour?
That brings me to a final thought I want to leave with you, the listener. We've talked about how these tools let us model the world with incredible precision. We can calculate the most efficient path, the most accessible neighborhood.
We can optimize almost anything spatial.
Right. But as we optimize our cities based on these algorithms building roads where the model says traffic flows, zoning housing where the isochrones say it's accessible, we are, in effect, reshaping the physical world to match our data.
We are. The map is starting to direct the territory.
So the question is, as we get better and better at predicting human movement, are we just observing how people move? Or are we creating a feedback loop where the algorithms dictate the movement and we just follow the path of least resistance that the code laid out for us?
That is the ultimate geospatial question. We shape our tools, and our tools shape our cities.
Something to chew on the next time you follow that blue line on your GPS without a second thought. That's it for this deep dive into geospatial data science essentials. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.